I want to ask you, Chris. You've talked about how you had some peak years where there was like no shortage of white sharks around the Western Cape and in False Bay. And can you tell us a little bit what's been going on recently? Because I know that the population seems to have gone down. Do you have any ideas as to what's happening?
Yeah, look, I mean, we've all got our own ideas and all got our own opinions, and unfortunately, there's a lot of conjecture about it that really clouds the issue. They're too strong. Well, let me go back a little bit. Around about 2012, 2013, we started seeing a decline in the numbers of great whites at Seal Island. And remember, I kept data from day one, and we also kept data not only on predation, but on every single great white shark that we saw come to our boat. So we had accurate numbers on how many animals we'd see on a daily basis over the years. And yeah, so in the early 2000 teens, we started seeing a decline. And then around about 2014, the decline was steep. And tragically, by 2018, there were no longer any great white sharks at Seal Island in False Bay. And what we learned from the very earliest of days, because I was making a living out of working with these animals, so you wanted to know where they were to find them, to take tourists to see them. So we learned when they weren't at Seal Island, which essentially was for 7 to 8 months of the year, we learned that they were inshore. And the inshore areas where we found them correlated 100% with where there were high numbers of these smaller sharks called smoothhound sharks, and then another species of shark called siphon sharks. So we knew that those were the areas that where we would find them. And unfortunately, the numbers of those small sharks really started to plummet just before we noticed a massive decline in the white sharks. And there was a fishery that was really starting to get traction at about that time called the demersal shark longline fishery, that was very heavily fishing these sharks. They developed a very good market to export them to Australia for what they call flake, but it's fish and chips. And there were a couple of boats in particular that had really managed to figure out exactly where these small sharks could be found, where and when. So the populations in False Bay and surrounds were targeted first because the boats were initially based out of Hout Bay Harbour, Cork Bay and other areas. And then as they wiped out the small sharks from False Bay, so they started fishing on the Cape South Coast very successfully. So when we noticed that those small sharks disappeared, two things happened. First, we couldn't find the white sharks in those areas where the small sharks used to be anymore. And secondly, the white sharks started coming to Seal Island earlier in those first few years when we started noticing the drop-off. And instead of being there at the time when the young seals were really going out to feed for themselves and it was the optimal time for them to hunt, they were coming there prior to that time. And what they were doing is they were essentially scavenging on the northern side of the island, waiting for sick, dead or dying seals to come out. And we couldn't figure out why there'd been this change. But over time, what I think was potentially happening, and it is my own hypothesis, is that they were supplementing the shortfall of the smaller sharks inshore with another food source that they were trying to kind of make a go of it, feed on these dead, sick and dying seals. And then there are still some of these smaller sharks left. So combined, there was possibly enough. So we started seeing a decline of the great whites from as early as 2012, 2013. The other school of thought that is very popular in South Africa is that two orcas, known as port and starboard, and they're known as port and starboard because their dorsal fins collapse. One goes to the left and the other goes to the right, appeared on the scene around about 2015. There was a sighting in False Bay, one sighting in False Bay 2015. The next sighting was in False Bay was 2017. So I personally do not believe that the orcas in False Bay played any part in the major decline in these animals, because you cannot blame something that wasn't there when the decline was already happening. And also, these orcas come into our area, they came into the area once. An entire population of great whites that's been there for decades in a preferred feeding area is not going to be pushed away forever by infrequent visits. But in 2017, these two orcas were implicated in killing at least 5 white sharks in Gansbaai. And what certainly does happen, and we know this from the Farallon Islands, we know it from Australia, we know it from New Zealand when orcas predate on white sharks, is that the white sharks will move as an entire population for short to medium term. They'll leave an area and then they will come back to an area. And we saw that initially in Gansbaai, and we've seen it also in Mossel Bay and other areas. But it does not explain now the complete absence of great whites in False Bay, the complete, or almost, they have 1 or 2 sightings every few months in Gansbaai where they'd have 20 animals a day before. The almost complete absence in Gansbaai, and the major decline further along our coastline. So, yeah, by 2018, the great whites were gone from False Bay completely, and it was after that that the orca number, we started seeing port and starboard more frequently. And I'd actually been keeping data, because I keep data not just on great whites, but I keep data on anything interesting we see in the bay. And we had no less than 9 different pods of orcas in False Bay before port and starboard. They were dolphin specialists. We used to often see them close to Seal Island. In fact, I've got many photographs of the orcas knocking dolphins into the air and great white sharks with the same backgrounds killing seals, also flying through the air. And often we'd sit at Seal Island and see the one, and just in the distance we'd see the orcas chasing the dolphins. And I recorded data on 43 different events where the two were within about 5 miles of each other, and there was virtually no decline or change in behavior of the white sharks over those times. So I very strongly believe that, yes, orcas do play a part, and it's short and medium term, as has happened in the Farallones, Australia and New Zealand, but I certainly don't believe that 2 orcas are going to displace an entire population from preferred feeding areas over such a huge stretch of coastline. And if you look at it from a terrestrial equivalent, and I spend a huge amount of time in the bush as well with my photography, when a pride of lions comes into an area, for example, yes, it will displace the wild dogs and the cheetah and the smaller predators, but those animals cannot afford to give up a favorable feeding environment forever. So as those lions move through the area, those other animals work around them, and you have predatory shifts related to apex predators, but you do not simply give up an area. So my firm belief, and it is only my opinion, is that the smaller prey species are vital to the sharks, and the predator goes where the prey goes. And then I think that the South African white shark population is not nearly as robust as people thought. There have been genetic studies that have shown that it's a relatively small genetic population. And then I think there's still massive pressures facing these animals. The Natal Sharks Board, which kills between 11 and 60 great white sharks a year, it's the world's largest government-sanctioned great white killing machine on the planet, is still out there. We have poaching, we have bycatch, we have death due to illegal recreational fishing. You have these animals being essentially stripped of one of their main food sources, and then you have the added pressure of orcas. I simply don't think South Africa's great white shark population is robust enough to handle all these things. So that's my humble opinion, and there are many that will disagree, and yeah, that's the way it is.
It's interesting. I mean, I know from talking with people that are up on the KZN, KwaZulu-Natal coast there, in the last couple of years have commented that they've seen more white sharks up that way than they'd seen in the past. And a few people have speculated that maybe the population, as you suggest, has been displaced, and maybe it's more common up on the East Coast now, perhaps. Maybe they've moved further up on the West Coast. Do you think, have you heard anything along those lines at all about the populations that are actually just shifting?
Yeah, Dave, so there's a school of thought that says the population has shifted eastward. Mm-hmm. And it's generally the school of thought that's shared by government scientists and management. Mm-hmm. And they kind of say, okay, well, the white shark population hasn't crashed, it's gone somewhere else. But that's simply not true. So if you look at the eastward shift, once you leave Gansbaai, your next big major great white shark aggregation site is Mossel Bay. Mm-hmm. And I work very closely with the lead scientist there, Dr. Enrico Gennari, and their data now is showing a slow to medium-sized decline. Mm-hmm. Then for the last 2 years with Professor Neil Hammerschlag, we've done a study based at Robberg, which is the next white shark hotspot. And that study has been looking at population numbers based cliff observation, where they look down into the water and they count the sharks that are coming there. And there's no increase in numbers of sharks there. Then when we go east, the next port of call is Port Elizabeth. And Port Elizabeth has had basically very scant data collection and irregular data collection at a place called Bird Island over time. I mean, yes, there have been studies being done there, but it hasn't been very continuous, sustained, and done on a daily basis. And the commercial operator that's working there, a chap by the name of Lloyd Edwards, he's been keeping data for the last 3 years, and he is not seeing an increase in numbers. In fact, they see very few individual white sharks, and they see the same animals time and time again. What they are noticing in Port Elizabeth, and I think this is where the confusion comes in, is that the local recreational anglers, who actually in many cases illegally targeting these animals, and their number, the anglers' numbers have increased over time, and they've become more efficient at catching them. They're catching more than they historically were, but there's no data, there's no consistent database, because these guys weren't fishing for them in the way they are 20, 25, even 15, 10 years ago. And then if we go even further east to the Natal Sharks Board, and that I think is a pretty consistent way of ascertaining what the population numbers are over time, because the effort is relatively consistent. They're catching less great whites than ever before. So I do not see where the eastern shift is at all.
It's that at this point anyway.
Right. Yeah.
No, and the West Coast has always had scant records of great white sharks in South Africa. They were traditionally transitory animals. They used to be irregularly seen in Table Bay. There were, in fact, famous shark attacks. In 1942, there was a fatal shark attack at Clifton Beach, which is one of South Africa's glamorous beaches. In 1976, there was another famous attack on a guy called Jeffrey Spence, who ironically at the time was reenacting the Jaws scene, believe it or not, and he got bitten. So there were records certainly over time from Table Bay and the West Coast, but never regular numbers. Nowadays, you simply do not hear of these animals on the West Coast, period. And to take this whole discussion a bit further, the False Bay population was comprised primarily of sub-adult sharks and about 15% of adult sharks, which was by a long way the largest average size of white sharks in South Africa. Mossel Bay's population is usually small to teenage sharks. Gans Bay was typically teenage sharks with a few sub-adults thrown in. And that population from False Bay that we monitored very closely, and I used to tag them in the early days, there was very little overlap with Gans Bay. So it was almost like a distinctive population of these big animals that didn't really go to too many other places. And subsequent to their disappearance from False Bay, these really massive great whites have just not shown up anywhere. So if you had to ask me what's happened to them, I can't tell you. I don't know the answer. I really hope in my heart of hearts to be so wrong about it. I would love nothing more than to be wrong about this, and that these great whites come back and it was just due to a huge climatic shift and changing bodies of water, and they found a happy sharky place somewhere else where there's lots of food. But yeah, I guess maybe I've become a bit jaded and skeptical over time. Yeah, let's see what happens.
Obviously, it's understandable. I mean, you've been watching these these great whites your entire career. You created a business based off of it. A lot of your photography creations have been from that. And it's really interesting to see the big change all of a sudden. And what's interesting to me as somebody like, I have another podcast that deals with ocean news and so forth. And the only news that I see from other media outlets is the orca problem, and that seems to be the overall narrative that's come out. This is the first time, actually, when I was watching one of your other interviews with Gemma, was the first time that I heard of another problem with fisheries and looking at sort of the shark species that you mentioned that was being depleted from fishing and for the fish and chips. And so it's really interesting just to get that conversation out there and to get that information out there, because that doesn't seem to be the narrative that's coming out a lot of these media outlets, because maybe it's not as sexy as, hey, orcas are depleting the great white population, and that's a shame, to be honest, of that being the narrative.
I think, it's just to add in, Chris, because I'm right here in Monterey, like the Farallones are just up the coast here from me. I get a few shifts that we've seen. I mean, orcas are, unlike the Western Cape where orcas are not as common. Orcas are pretty common here at times of the year, and they're feeding on the gray whales. It's not uncommon. There's a few pods here, but the other thing we've had is a shift over the last sort of 7-8 years now, whereas the little young of the year white sharks, which used to be common, which are still common in Southern California and Northern Baja, they've taken up residency here in Monterey Bay, which is a huge shift for them. And again, we're kind of talking about, kind of going, straight on a straight shot here versus South Africa being more of having a kind of a semicircle there. That the whole your idea that the population may have shifted, there may be some validity to that, because we've definitely seen it here in California. And as I say, we have orcas are pretty common around here, and as you say, they'll come into the Farallon Islands and they'll not maybe knock off a white shark now and then, and they'll move the sharks off a little bit, but they come back as soon as the orcas move away. And so I think your ideas about maybe the population shifting, maybe some changing oceanographic conditions, the populations move to a sharkier area. Maybe it is something to do with some of their other main prey, the little sharks being consumed. It sounds like it'd be a terrific study, and it sounds like you've already been keeping a lot of notes just from your own experiences out there and what's going on. I should find somebody to follow up on that and see to really look at what's going on, why the white sharks are in decline.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, Andrew, there's been a lot in the media about it. We did 3 big stories on CNN. One was half an hour long. There's a really interesting website if you want to get that side of the story called it's www.sharkfreechips.com, and it's just got a lot of hard-hitting facts that I think if people became more aware of, that they would find very interesting. At the end of the day, the reality is that for government scientists and government fisheries managers, you can't manage 2 orcas. It's a natural phenomenon. You can manage small shark populations and overfishing of them, and it's quite easy to blame 2 orcas if you just want the problem to go away. So I'll let people make of that what they like, but the reality is that all the areas that I've been to in the world where I've dived with white sharks, pretty much bar 1 or 2, there's been a reliance on fish or sharks to a certain degree as prey. Even in a place like Chatham, Cape Cod, when we were there, I was chatting to the guys and saying, well, you've got the white sharks inshore feeding on the grey seals, but what are these animals doing, at other times of the year? Where do they go? Show me the movements. And they showed me the patterns where they were seeing these white sharks. And I said, well, what's out here? So, well, that's where the guys catch the spiny dogfish. And when I was in Australia, I chatted to Andrew Fox, and I said to, Andrew, where did your white sharks, where did they historically go when they're not at the Neptune Islands? Or he said, well, and he showed me on a map, he said, these areas. And I said, well, why did they used to go there? He said, well, we used to have huge populations of gummy sharks. And gummy sharks are what we call smoothhound sharks in South Africa. And I went to the museum in Port Lincoln, and I started looking at a lot of the photographs of dead white sharks that they used to kill there. And inside these white sharks, they were full of gummy sharks. And then when I've dived on the seafloor with the great whites at Stewart Island off New Zealand, there's no real reason for them to be at Edwards Island, which is the main focal point, because the seals are strung out over huge stretches of the coastline. And when I've been diving with them there on the seafloor, what do I see there? A whole lot of spiny dogfish again. And, in South Africa, where we look at where the white sharks occur here, you've got a seal colony, and then close inshore in the 3 hotspots for white sharks. We'll call it 4 hotspots for white sharks in South Africa. Every single one is you've got a seal colony, whether it's False Bay, Dyer Island, Mossel Bay, or Bird Island. You've got a seal colony. But inshore of that, you've got areas with very historically robust populations of these small sharks. And that's where the white sharks are to be found in the summer months. And then if we take it one step further and we look at the necropsies done on 592 different great white sharks in the Natal Shark Sport Net over a 10-year period, which is the largest study of dead white sharks in the world, more than 60% of the diet of those sharks is made up of of the great whites, is made up of teleos, so bony fish, and small sharks. So I just cannot get it right in my head that people don't see, if you remove all these small sharks, which no longer exist in False Bay and are now hugely depleted along the rest of our coastline. In fact, the soupfin sharks have now just been listed as critically endangered, which I think we all know means imminently threatened with extinction. The smoothhounds have been listed as vulnerable. If you take away their prey, they've got problems. So, yeah, it's a big deal that the prey has been taken out. And in today's day and age, I cannot understand how we in South Africa can condone the essentially fishing of a species to extinction, to send it to Australia, a first world country who does not need to eat a threatened species of shark for fish and chips. And yeah, that's what we've really campaigned very hard for. And I think my lesson going forward is not so much what we can do to save South Africa's sharks. It's more a case of, I really want people to hear this in other parts of the world where they're so lucky to have great whites, that you cannot manage just a single species being the great white. You need to manage the entire ecosystem in which it lives.
Really, that's perfect. Yep, that's exactly
And do you think,
right. Yep.
when you mention people in Australia eating them, do you think people know that they're eating shark and fish and chips? A lot of times fish and chips come, they're breaded. People just, I'm going to order fish and chips. Here in North America, it's usually cod or haddock. But a lot of times, if I ask people, hey, what kind of fish did you have in your fish and chips? They're like, I don't know. Maybe it's cod, maybe it's not. There are a lot of people who just don't know what they're eating. Do you think that's the case in sort of your history with this? Do you think that's the case in Australia where people don't know what they're eating?
Yeah, so I think it's a mixture. I think there's a significant part of the Australian population that's very aware that they're eating shark. It's been done for a long time. I don't think that population, up until recently, was fully aware that a large number of their sharks were coming from South Africa and the catastrophic effect it's having on our coastline. And there are campaigns now in Australia to make Australians more aware. Australians regulate their fishery very well. It's incredibly well monitored. The compliance is very good. In South Africa, we have none of that. In fact, the most successful demersal shark longlining vessel was caught by ourselves because the government wouldn't go out and send their own patrol boats out. So we sent our boats out. We caught this longline fishing vessel fishing in South Africa's flagship marine protected area, catching these smaller sharks, including many hundreds of endangered smooth hammerhead sharks and others. So not only are they killing unprecedented numbers of these smaller target species, but they're also catching many vulnerable and threatened species as well. And, this has all been brought to the government's attention, but sadly, for whatever reason, they've just issued 4 new shark longline licenses to target essentially a critically endangered species. I mean, it's unthinkable. It's like issuing permits to hunters to go and shoot cheetahs and wild dogs to commercially sell them to somewhere else for jerky. It's beyond me.